Thank you so much. And I have one word, which is wow. Because it has been one heck of a day, and to really be on the heels of these amazing presenters, I'm grateful to be here. I'm humbled to be here, and I hope that I can provide another lens to this discussion. Just by way of background, I've spent over 20 years now in family medicine, in our family medicine clinic, helping our providers be better prescribers. That's basically my role, and that's how I define it. And along with that has come a lot of questions and asks around prenatal supplements. And so I think with some of the research we've done, along the lines of the research that you've done, we've got some interesting information that I can share with you today. And like many of the speakers, we were given a lot of questions to answer in 25 minutes. And I was able to just put these into really four main categories, which is to really talk about the variations in the formulations that are available, specifically prescription and non-prescription formulations, the bioavailability of these formulations, the characteristics that might help indicate high quality formulations, and then different sources of the supplements in these formulations as well. And we've talked a lot about this today, so I think this will actually be a very good wrap up to the discussion. So I just want to start with just by showing you the label that our patients are faced with. And in fact, this is two of potentially a couple hundred that might be available online or in the store at CVS. And you can see here, I'm just going to point out a few things that I think are really important when we look at what is it that our consumers and our patients are looking at. So if you take, for example, of the folic acid, you can see in the one on the left, it's 1 milligram of folic acid, 200% of the daily value, but then on the other label we have folate, which is now converted to the dietary folate equivalents. And then the patient is left to interpret, what does that mean? Am I getting folic acid or am I not? Then the next one is calcium, which of course we just talked about. Both are coming from calcium carbonate. They both have 200 milligrams, but one's saying I'm getting 20% and the other is saying I'm getting 15% of my daily value. So which, am I getting enough or am I not getting enough, and how much am I getting? Then next we have the iron. And again, these issues have been talked about today, the ferrous fumarate being the more commonly available. But then in the one on the right, which you may not be able to see that well, we have two different forms of iron, none of which are ferrous fumarate, and again, put into different contexts with the milligrams. And then lastly, vitamin D3, both cholecalciferol, 400 IUs, although there's also translated somehow to 10 micrograms, and the percent daily value is also different. So I just bring this up as a point of which we all may in this room very well know, but to someone like my girlfriend who's shopping at CVS or Walgreens has no idea. So I think when I look into the context of this discussion today, I'm also looking at the view of how are we communicating this information to the patients who are ultimately taking them. Because the science is really great and it's important. It's also important that we translate it in a way that's meaningful and relevant for the patients that we're seeing. So I'm going to talk now about the difference between prescription and over-the-counter formulations. And I'm going to start initially by talking about the labels, and then I'll talk a bit more about the actual content. So when we look at labels, there have been several studies that have been done. This is actually a study that was done recently that refers to these two databases that were mentioned in the prior session, looking at the label information. And you can see that, a couple hundred products were evaluated. Overall, non-prescription formulations have more vitamins and minerals in them. Doesn't mean that it's better, but it means that there is more. In fact, there is 19 roughly in the non-prescription versus 13 in the prescription. Prescription products notoriously have higher folic acid content, but the non-prescription have higher contents related to vitamin A and D, iodine and calcium. And then, of course, in our non-prescription products, there's a lot more stuff. So there could be botanical ingredients or milk thistle, for example, or there could be a probiotic, for example. So there can often in the non-prescription realm also have additional ingredients. And so I think it's important to recognize that the regulation of these two are slightly different, but could be important in terms of what the patient ultimately receives. This was a study that our group did at the University of Colorado, just looking at, again, over 200 different labels. And you can see that, again, we found non-prescription supplements to have more calcium, iodine, and vitamin D. The prescriptions had more iron and folic acid. Choline was actually on the labels of more non-prescription products than prescription products, which I think is important for the discussions that we had earlier today. And one of the things that we also did was look at how well that prescription product corrects the deficit if we consider the dietary the dietary considerations. And what we found is that for iron and folic acid, we can do a pretty good job. But for many of the other ingredients, similar to what Dr. Bailey was just sharing, we may not be reaching even our recommended amounts with those products. There was another study that looked at the label as well as the analytically measured content. So it's taking this one step further. It was 24 prescription products evaluated. This was based actually on 61% of the market share. So most of the products that were available. And you can see here on the labels that they all listed folic acid, vitamins B6, D, E, and iron. Most of them had niacin, riboflavin, thiamine, and vitamin C, B12, and zinc on them. But only 71% actually listed the amount of calcium. And then even fewer had iodine, which was mentioned earlier, as well as DHA. When we look at content, now there's concern about how far these products actually have more content than what the label is indicating. So when we talk about the excessive nature of the nutrients, we can see it can transpire here in the formulations as well. So we had overages of more than 20% for folic acid, niacin, riboflavin, vitamin A, B12, and D. And in fact, the overage for vitamin D was 29%. And that's the fat-soluble vitamin. So there are ways that we can essentially overdo the vitamin D in these products. And then you can see as well for the others, it actually was below label results for thiamine, which of course is an important B vitamin. When we looked at this as well, so in our labs, we just focused on 3 key ingredients, mostly as proxies. We had 20 non-prescription and 16 prescription products that were evaluated. When combined, the labels indicated that most of these products would meet the recommended daily intakes. However, when we looked at the content, we actually found under amounts rather than over amounts with some of the products that we evaluated. Now, these products we actually acquired through Amazon or the drugstore. So we were trying to kind of play the blind mystery shopper, so to speak. And we found actually less content in the product than what was advertised on the labels. And then I think when we look specifically at an ingredient like folic acid, which of course we've talked about today and we all acknowledge is a critical nutrient. This was data that came from the Dietary Supplements Labeled Database, which was mentioned earlier, as well as Daily Med. And really there are some things that came out from this. First of all, right now we don't have clear recommendations on how we should be communicating the folic acid requirement. Is it through dietary folate equivalents? Is it through micrograms of folic acid? Or if we're using different forms of folate, for example, I'll talk a little bit in the metabolically active folate, is that what's communicated? And then how do we communicate to people what's the difference? And is it better or is it not? We found that actually in this study, they found that a majority of the products actually had more than 800 micrograms of folic acid, which was the prior daily value, in more than 90% of prescription and non-prescription labels. So a very high amount of folic acid in these products. And these labeled amounts were higher than what's recommended. And so I think my kind of takeaway from this portion, especially on the folic acid, is that we need to have more consistent and clear recommendations for how we're expressing folic acid in the labeling, what is the recommended daily value, the upper limits of that is, and how far can we push it. Luckily with folic acid, we can push it quite far, but that's not the case for every nutrient. And, some of these products will go so far as to make health claims. Now, the FDA is looking for those, and then we don't want them to be on the market. But many of them will put health claims on their labels, and of course, that plays into the marketing and what patients see. This is looking more at the iron debate. So that was folic acid. This is more an iron. And this was touched on earlier, but I think also just keeping in mind that the form of iron does make a difference for how much iron the patient actually acquires. We have ferrous sulfate, fumarate, and gluconate. And this was mentioned earlier in the presentation that ferrous sulfate is the most commonly used iron in clinical trials, but is not the most commonly used iron in supplements. And so that creates kind of this conflict between the data and the trials, and then how does that translate in real life? And you can see that there's a broad range of elemental iron in the different products that have been used, anywhere from 9 to 106 milligrams per serving, keeping in mind that most of them have around 27. But again, to Dr. Bailey's point about the wide variety of product availability, this is one of them. And so I think, again, just pointing to maybe looking at what are the chemical forms, can we create some consistency around that, or should we create some consistency? Bioavailability becomes an issue, and I'll talk about that in just a little bit. Of course, the safety profiles, especially with iron, and iron binds to a lot of things. And so what does that do either to other medications or even within the body? And then, the amount of iron that's needed when you have someone who's iron replete or iron deficient. And this has been a theme throughout the day today. One thing I want to point out that was maybe alluded to a little bit earlier by our representative from ODS is there is a non-prescription prenatal multivitamin calculator. And what this ingredient database has done is create estimates for what women may have actually in their product when you go to this calculator. So when you go to this website, you can actually type in what does your label say, and then it will give you an estimate of how much would actually be in that product. And that can be helpful, especially when we have products with so many different ingredients in them, and every product has a different number of ingredients. So it helps to at least identify what might be there. Now, what I would love to see is this added to the picture of a diet. If I have my, Fitbit diet app going, or my Lose It app going, or whatever, how can I compare what I'm actually eating with what I'm actually taking, and what does that look like? More to that personalized concept, but not quite so Star Trek-y with the genome and all that kind of thing. But I think there are ways that we could enhance the information that we can collect and get and know better what to do on that individualized basis with calculators like this. So in summary, for this portion, there's really inconsistent information that's expressed on the labels, and I would love to see a little bit more standardization around that for the patients to better understand what they're consuming. There's differences expressed between what's on the label and then actually what's in the bottle, and that's also, a scenario that we need to be concerned with. There are some differences between the non-prescription and prescription products, in terms of statistical significance, but when I'm looking at it, kind of overall, my gut's telling me it may not be clinically significantly different in a healthy population. Now, again, we were asked to talk more kind of about our population as a pretty well-to-do country. For me, what that tells me is that when I'm thinking about access and cost to our patients, it doesn't really matter if I have a prescription or a non-prescription product most of the time. And so that may help them access these supplements more easily if cost is an issue. And then I just mentioned earlier about resources being available to estimate the amounts of ingredients in these products, and hopefully there could be a way for us to add dietary information as well. So the next thing I want to touch on is the bioavailability. Now, I can't possibly cover over 20 ingredient bioavailabilities in 25 minutes, or rather like 5 minutes for this section. So I just want to kind of point out a few things and maybe give a few examples. So first of all, even this concept of PMVM or prenatal multivitamin and mineral, you mentioned the definition that you have in your lab of 3 vitamins or more, and we don't have consistency necessarily except for there's several vitamins or minerals. We know that there can be varied composition in terms of ingredients and dose and salt forms. And these have evolved over time. And now we're adding things into these products like the botanicals and the probiotics and the DHA and EPA. We continue to move the needle really on the composition. And we all may interpret what it means to be a multivitamin and mineral differently. Does that include DHA or does it not? Does it include a probiotic or does it not? And then when we talk about true bioavailability or how much of that drug or supplement is getting into the body, it really differs with every single ingredient. So the way that we absorb iron is much different than how we absorb choline, for example. And it can be affected by our own homeostatic mechanisms, our own body factors. For example, we've talked about the iron status being an important predictor of the need or the want for iron in the body. It can be affected by the size of the ingested load. The classic example is calcium, where we recommend that no more than 500 milligrams of calcium be consumed at one time. Because once you get beyond that, you're not going to absorb any more calcium than that. And we want calcium carbonate to be taken with food, and calcium citrate doesn't matter as much. But those are the small nuances for bioavailability that can make a big difference in terms of how much the body might actually see. We talked already quite a bit about folic acid, so I won't go into that. And just to our point about that U-curve, higher bioavailability is not necessarily better. It may mean we absorb more, but that may or may not be a good thing if we're leading into excess. When we look at other factors for bioavailability, keep in mind that the way bioavailability is measured is through dissolution. So what happens is they'll put a tablet or a capsule into a solution and they wait to see how long it takes for that to dissolve. And that's in a solution. Well, our bodies can be different. And this is its closest proxy as we have right now, but it doesn't give us a true picture of what each individual person can actually absorb. And so we have these different chemical forms and nutrient interactions. So iron and zinc, for example, when you get high enough levels of iron or excessive iron, you completely shut down the zinc bioavailability. And so that can create a problem. Here, vitamin C can interact with iron, magnesium and calcium also can interact with iron. So there are these subtle interactions that can affect bioavailability in these products as well. When we look at other factors that can be even related to the excipients or the inactive ingredients that are affecting all these, and I want to go into every single detail here because I've provided several examples. I think it's just important to recognize that when we have a multivitamin formulation packed into one pill, we have this risk of different processes and different interactions happening. So vitamin D is the classic. We just got done talking about vitamin D with a great presentation. And we didn't even talk about the fact that that can facilitate absorption or not of other ingredients and in fact toxic elements as well. And so we have a dissolution standard that's brought to us by the USP, but it's a completely voluntary system. And you don't have to do this as a company. We hope that you will, but you don't have to. And when I did a quick interaction of, looking at prenatal vitamins and other types of things through our Micromedics database, which is a drug interaction database, there was 171 drug-drug interactions. One was contraindicated with a really wacky drug I've never really heard of before, but 23 major interactions, 112 moderate interactions, and 35 minor. And I just gave a few examples of common drugs. I mean, how many women do we have on a statin? Our advanced age pregnancy patients, right? And, the fact that we have niacin or something like that in a prenatal vitamin, right? We're trying to do the right thing, but we don't maybe think about that unintended consequence. And then even ingredients within the supplement, which is an iron and zinc together, can create a drug interaction as well. So I think what we're getting to is, what would you choose? Do you choose this individual supplement, by nutrient, or are we okay with accepting that with the convenience and the access to one tablet, we're going to come up with some potential conflicts of the data and the information that we have for bioavailability? And the last thing I want to touch on is just obesity. And we've talked about this in different contexts. This was one of the questions that came up. Women who are obese actually have overall lower A, D, E, and K levels. You wouldn't maybe expect that because these are fat-soluble vitamins, but because of the volumetric dilution and hepatic signaling, we actually find that there may be lower levels of these vitamins, and that can affect bioavailability as well. So in summary, with bioavailability, we have definitions and requirements that haven't really been established. We know that many human characteristics can affect the bioavailability. I've mentioned more than enough of the potential drug interactions that could occur, and we don't have a good way of systemically evaluating those drug interactions, but we know that they can be there. And so I think maybe an individualized approach could be ideal, but it may not be feasible. So then if that's the case, then how do we assure, at least at a minimum, that patients are getting a high quality supplement? And so I'll talk a little bit about what I think are probably our top three quality assurance agencies. The USP I've mentioned already. NSF also has a content certified mark. Consumer Lab is another company that does this, and they all have slightly different nuances, but essentially these companies are testing the processes and the labels with the content in the bottle to make sure that it at least is what it says it is. It's not even saying that this is safe or it's efficacious. It's just saying that whatever's on the bottle is what it is, and it doesn't contain harmful levels of contaminants, which is a concern, especially when we're pulling in things from fish, right? So if we're using a DHA, we might be worried about toxicity of mercury or something like that. And then I think just as a kind of overall caveat, avoiding products with health claims, because I'm always a little skeptical of that. With the market, keeping in mind that these products are not regulated the same way that prescription medicines are. Many of these are just over-the-counter, non-prescription, and we want to make sure that patients are getting a high-quality product when possible. There was one study that was recently published out of Canada looking at 26 common products. You can see there that almost half exceeded standards for lead toxicity. 3 out of 51 exceeded acceptable arsenic levels. They found aluminum, nickel, titanium, and thallium in all the samples. About a quarter, or less than a quarter, had detectable mercury, but all were within the acceptable limits. And then there was no correlation between cost and level of contamination. So it wasn't that the higher expensive products were less likely to be contaminated. It really didn't matter. And so from my standpoint, as a pharmacist and doing this for a long time, I'm much more concerned about the safety side than I am about the efficacy when it comes to like, what do I prioritize first? And I think we should be testing for toxic elements. It concerns me that so many of them had excessive lead. We all know the lead's not good. We don't eat our windowsills with paint, right? I mean, that's not good. We should have maybe some guidelines for what are the acceptable levels in that regard, emphasizing preconception care, products that are high quality for patients, and additional regulation as well. Maybe a better partnership with government oversight and accountability. We do a pretty good job, and I give a lot of kudos to the Office of Dietary Supplements for putting information out there. They really do a good job. And I think it's that fine line of how much you get the FDA involved or not. And I understand that there's a lot behind all that. I just would like to see, can we do better with some of the standards that we have? And then lastly, just two quick slides about sources of nutrients. And this has somewhat been covered. We talked earlier today about omega-3s. That was one of the first talks of the morning. And we know that they're essential. We know that they often will come from fish oils. They can come from plant sources, which can be converted, but most of them come from fish. And so the best sources really are diet. And I think that's a message we've heard all day. We will continue to say, if we can get it from the diet, we want to encourage that. If people are going to use supplements, then I would say purified fish oil would be the safest source. And so that helps to minimize some of that toxic elements that can be there. And then we talked more recently today about folate or folic acid, understanding that there's this conversion process that has to take place to the L5-methyltetrahydrofolate. Now I want to just say, and this wasn't specifically said, but there's a reason some of the experts favor this metabolically active form because it's been found that maybe 40 to 60% of our population has genetic polymorphisms that don't allow for that conversion to happen properly. Not true. Okay, so we'll talk about that. I think it points to looking at the genetics and we do this in other realms. So it's fast metabolizers, slow metabolizers, or any metabolizer. And so trying to take a look at what are the potential impacts there, and how do we then sort out which is the best, and how do we communicate that to the patient? So folate, folic acid, knowing that diet's best. So in conclusions, there's a lot of variation with these supplements. I think it calls for standardization on labels and in content. The bioavailability varies on the characteristics of the product as well as the person. I do think we have high quality products that are out there, and if there's any, for those of you that are clinicians out there, if there's anything that you can say is look for the stamp of approval. Look for the USP verification. That's like step number one to ensuring that you have a better quality ingredient. And then lastly, just recognizing that there are different sources for these nutrient supplements, and it may not really be that important if we have a healthy, nutritious diet. So with that, I will conclude and say thank you again and look forward to your questions.